The courtroom was full of anticipation as the trial began. Jamal Carter, a black man in his early 30s, sat at the defendant's table. He wore a neat suit, his appearance calm but with a hint of tension in his eyes. His attorney, Rachel Thompson, stood by his side, ready to defend him. Today was important, not just for Jamal, but for the unfair system he had been thrust into. Jamal wasn't just here to face a minor charge. He was up against something far bigger, an unjust system that had often treated him as less than others. The judge, Judge Barbara Pierce, entered the courtroom with a confident stride. She was in her 50s, wearing a black robe that seemed to hold an air of superiority. People in the room murmured under their breath as she took her seat on the bench. This was her courtroom, and everyone knew it. She had a reputation for being tough, but not in the way a judge should be. No, her reputation was built on something else. She was known for being dismissive, especially when it came to people who didn't fit her idea of a proper citizen. Jamal had been warned about her, but he wasn't prepared for how quickly the tension would escalate. The courtroom quieted, and the trial began. Rachel started presenting her case, trying to defend Jamal, who was accused of a minor offense. But every time Rachel spoke, Judge Pierce would cut her off with sharp remarks. She questioned Rachel's arguments with an air of superiority, acting as if she already knew everything there was to know. It wasn't just the words. It was the way Judge Pierce looked at Jamal, like he was already guilty before even hearing the case. Jamal sat still, not letting the judge's attitude get to him. He had learned over the years to keep his emotions in check, especially in situations like this. But he could feel the judge's judgment weighing on him, and it was hard to ignore. Rachel, however, noticed what was happening. She could see the way the judge was treating Jamal and could feel the unfairness creeping into the proceedings. As she continued to argue Jamal's innocence, Judge Pierce's attitude became more apparent. The judge's sharp words became more personal, as if Jamal wasn't even worthy of respect in her eyes. It wasn't just the accusations or the court proceedings. Judge Pierce was making it clear that she thought Jamal, because of his background, didn't belong here. Her comments were subtle at first, but they didn't go unnoticed. Jamal looked up at the judge, trying to maintain his composure. He knew he had to stay calm. It was important that he didn't lose control. His life, his future, depended on this moment. Rachel looked at him, sensing the rising tension. She knew this was no ordinary case. It was more than just legal arguments. It was about dignity. But Judge Pierce wasn't making it easy. The room felt heavier as Judge Pierce continued to speak, her words dripping with a judgment that had nothing to do with the law. It wasn't about guilt or innocence anymore. It was about a biased view, a belief that some people, like Jamal, were always guilty, no matter what. As she finished speaking, she gave Jamal a look that seemed to say, "You don't belong here." Jamal clenched his jaw, determined not to let the judge's attitude break him. But he couldn't help but feel the injustice of the situation. This wasn't just a trial for him. It was a trial for anyone who had ever been unfairly judged because of the color of their skin. And with every word that came from Judge Pierce's mouth, Jamal knew he was about to face something much bigger than just the charges against him. The courtroom had fallen silent, the atmosphere thick with tension. Jamal sat there, gripping the edge of the table, his thoughts racing. He had done nothing wrong, but the way Judge Pierce had been speaking to him made him feel like he was already guilty. He could feel the weight of her gaze on him, a gaze that seemed to strip him of his dignity with every word she spoke. Rachel, his lawyer, had tried to intervene, but it seemed like the judge was determined to belittle him at every opportunity. Judge Pierce's voice echoed through the courtroom once again, but this time, her words were sharper, more personal. She had been dismissing Rachel's arguments all along, but now she turned her attention directly to Jamal. The judge's tone was condescending, and her words felt like a direct attack on him. It wasn't just about the case anymore. It felt like she was attacking his very character, assuming that just because he was a black man, he didn't deserve respect. Jamal could feel the anger bubbling up inside of him, but he did his best to remain calm, not wanting to make the situation worse. "Mr. Carter," Judge Pierce began, her voice dripping with disdain, "I've heard all about your kind before. You people always think you can get away with anything. I suppose this time, you were hoping to charm your way out of trouble, weren't you?" The words stung more than Jamal cared to admit. It was clear that Judge Pierce wasn't even trying to hide her prejudice anymore. She had crossed a line, and it was hard for Jamal to hold his tongue. He wanted to respond, to stand up for himself, but he knew better than to give in to the judge's provocation. He had learned long ago that responding with anger would only make things worse. Rachel, however, wasn't going to let this slide. She stepped forward, her voice firm as she addressed the judge. "Your Honor," she began, "I must insist that you show my client the respect he deserves. This kind of personal attack is not only inappropriate but also unbecoming of a judge." But Judge Pierce wasn't having it. She shot Rachel a glare, dismissing her words with a flick of her hand. "I'm the one in charge here, Miss Thompson," she snapped. "You're just the lawyer. Don't tell me how to do my job." The room was now uncomfortable, and people were beginning to shift in their seats. Some spectators were whispering among themselves, sensing the injustice in the air. Jamal could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, but this time, he wasn't the one in the wrong. It was the judge who had lost control of the situation. Jamal's heart was racing, but he kept his breathing steady, trying to maintain his composure. He knew he couldn't let her get away with this, but at the same time, he didn't want to make a scene. He was stuck between the desire to defend himself and the fear that any wrong move would lead to even more trouble. Judge Pierce seemed to take pleasure in the discomfort she had caused, smiling smugly as if she had won some small victory. "I suggest you stay quiet, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're lucky to be in this courtroom at all." That was the moment when Jamal knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. Her words were too much. This wasn't just about the trial anymore. It was about dignity, about standing up for himself when no one else would. The entire room waited, the tension rising as Jamal took a deep breath, preparing to say something that would change the course of this trial. Jamal's heart was pounding in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't let the judge's words slide any longer. He had to speak up, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been unfairly treated because of the color of their skin. The courtroom was still, everyone waiting to see what he would do next. He took a deep breath and stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving the judge. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, unsure of what would happen. Jamal knew this was a risk, but he couldn't remain silent anymore. The injustice in the air was thick, and he wasn't about to let it go unnoticed. "Judge Pierce," Jamal began, his voice steady but firm, "I've been trying to remain calm, but I can't sit here and let you speak to me like that. What you said, how you said it, it's wrong. It's not just wrong for me, but it's wrong for anyone who's ever been treated this way. It's not just a trial anymore. It's about respect." There was a pause, and the courtroom felt like it was frozen in time. Jamal's words hung in the air, and even Rachel, who had been doing her best to defend him, seemed to have found a new respect for his courage. He wasn't just defending himself now. He was speaking for anyone who had ever felt the sting of being judged unfairly. Judge Pierce's expression didn't change at first. She simply stared at him, her face hardening with annoyance. But there was something different now. She didn't expect him to speak back to her with such conviction. For a brief moment, her authority seemed to waver, but it quickly returned as she regained control of the room. "You are out of line, Mr. Carter," she said coldly, her voice much colder now. "I will not tolerate this kind of behavior in my courtroom." Jamal could feel his frustration growing, but he didn't raise his voice. He had to remain calm. The truth was on his side, and he knew it. "I'm not out of line, Your Honor," he replied, his tone still steady. "You are. You're supposed to be impartial. You're supposed to uphold the law, But what you've done here today is not justice. You've let your personal bias take over, and that's not what this court is about." A murmur ran through the room. Some of the spectators were beginning to understand what was happening. This wasn't just a small dispute between a defendant and a judge. This was about something much larger. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter who you were up against. Judge Pierce's face flushed with anger. She hadn't expected Jamal to challenge her like this, especially not in front of the whole courtroom. She had always prided herself on being in control, but now that control was slipping away from her. She tried to hide it behind her stern expression, but it was clear that Jamal's words had gotten under her skin. "Enough of this," she snapped, clearly frustrated. "I will not tolerate insubordination in my courtroom." But Jamal stood his ground. "I'm not being insubordinate, Your Honor. I'm standing up for what's right. I don't care about your position or your authority. I care about fairness. I care about dignity." The room was silent again, but this time, the silence felt different. It wasn't filled with tension, but with anticipation. Jamal had taken a step that no one had expected. He had called out the judge, not with anger, but with a calm and undeniable truth. And for the first time, it seemed like the power in the room had shifted. The audience, the lawyers, even the officers who were present, all watched as Jamal stood tall, unshaken. Rachel, standing next to him, was speechless for a moment. She had never seen him so calm yet so powerful. It was clear to her now, Jamal wasn't just fighting for his freedom. He was fighting for something far greater. And he wasn't going to back down. The silence in the courtroom stretched on, thick with the weight of what Jamal had just said. Everyone could feel the tension, the shift in the atmosphere, as the judge's authority was questioned openly. For a brief moment, even Judge Pierce seemed unsure of how to respond. She sat there, staring at Jamal, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her lips pursed in a thin line. The control she once held over the courtroom now felt fragile, slipping away with every word Jamal spoke. Rachel, who had been trying to hold the line for Jamal throughout the entire trial, was watching him now with a sense of admiration. She had never expected him to challenge the judge so directly. In all her years as a lawyer, she had seen clients get angry, upset, or even tearful in court, but Jamal's calm, measured response was something entirely different. He wasn't reacting out of emotion. He was standing his ground with quiet strength, making it clear that he would not let anyone, especially a judge, diminish his dignity. Judge Pierce, on the other hand, seemed to be struggling. Her sharp features tightened, and her eyes narrowed as she tried to regain her composure. She was used to controlling the room with her sharp words and strict authority. But Jamal's defiance was something new. He had refused to be intimidated, and in doing so, he had challenged everything she believed about her power. "Mr. Carter," Judge Pierce finally said, her voice forced and stiff, "you are testing my patience. I've warned you once, and I won't hesitate to remove you from this courtroom if you continue to defy me." But Jamal wasn't intimidated. His posture remained relaxed but firm, his gaze never wavering from the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady but clear, "I'm not trying to defy you. I'm simply asking for fairness. This trial, this courtroom, it's supposed to be about justice, right? I've been treated like I'm guilty before the trial even started. I'm not the one who is out of line here." There was a small murmur from the audience, and Jamal could feel their support. He could see the look in their eyes. Some were nodding in agreement, others just watching in awe at how he was handling the situation. For the first time, it felt like the crowd wasn't just waiting for the trial to go on. They were paying attention, really paying attention to what was happening. Rachel finally stepped in, her voice cutting through the tension. "Your Honor," she said, standing up tall with her briefcase in hand, "I respectfully ask that we proceed with the case. Jamal has been respectful throughout this entire trial, but this behavior, this prejudice you're showing him is unacceptable. If you cannot maintain fairness in this court, then we request that you recuse yourself." Jamal glanced at Rachel, surprised by how direct she was. He had expected her to back him up, of course, but the way she was standing up to the judge made him feel even more certain of the decision he'd made to speak up. It wasn't just his fight anymore, it was theirs together. Judge Pierce's face turned red. She was clearly seething, but her reaction only made the situation worse. She wasn't used to being confronted like this, not in her own courtroom. She had always been in control, and now her power was slipping through her fingers like sand. The once confident judge was now on the defensive. "I will not stand for this insubordination." Judge Pierce's voice was shaking with anger, but Jamal didn't flinch. He had already made his stand, and he wasn't backing down. "You're right," Jamal said quietly, his voice carrying across the courtroom. "You won't stand for it. You'll sit for it. Because you're the one who's been out of line. You're the one who's been disrespecting me, and everyone else who's been treated this way." His words were firm, but there was no malice in them, only truth. The judge opened her mouth to speak, but then she stopped. For a moment, there was no sound except for the deep, steady breaths of the people in the room. Judge Pierce's control was slipping, and she knew it. The once immovable figure in the courtroom now looked uncertain, unsure of how to handle the situation she had never expected. Jamal had turned the tables. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Every person in the room could feel the shift, like a storm was brewing, and no one knew when or how it would break. Jamal stood tall, his heart still racing, but his mind clearer than it had been throughout the entire trial. He had taken a risk, standing up to a judge who had the power to make or break his future. But in that moment, he felt more sure of himself than he ever had before. Judge Pierce, however, was visibly rattled. Her hand, which had been resting on the gavel, now gripped it tightly, as if trying to regain some form of control. Her lips trembled with frustration, and for the first time in the trial, her stern demeanor faltered. She had been used to silencing people like Jamal, those who dared to challenge her authority. But Jamal wasn't just challenging her authority. He was challenging the very foundation of how she had been conducting herself in the courtroom, and that she hadn't prepared for. Rachel, standing beside Jamal, kept her eyes on the judge, unwavering. She could see how much this meant to Jamal. This wasn't just about defending a case anymore. This was about standing up against something far larger than any of them. It was about calling out the unfairness, the deep-rooted biases that had no place in the justice system. She knew she had to stay calm, too, even though she felt her own anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "Your Honor, I respectfully ask again," Rachel said, her voice steady but firm, "to proceed with the trial without further interruption. My client has done nothing but show respect. We can continue this case, or we can have a proper discussion outside of this courtroom, but this behavior cannot continue." Jamal nodded in agreement. He wasn't just fighting for his own case. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, who had ever been pushed aside simply because of who they were. Judge Pierce shifted in her seat, clearly unwilling to back down, but also unsure of how to move forward. She wasn't used to being questioned like this. People had always respected her position, feared it even. But now, Jamal's quiet strength was unraveling the power she thought she held. Her gaze locked onto Jamal's, and for a brief moment, she seemed to hesitate, almost as if she were trying to find a way to regain control of the situation. "You're wasting my time, Mr. Carter," she finally snapped, but there was no conviction in her voice. It was the first sign of uncertainty she had shown, and it didn't go unnoticed. The room was still. The audience waited for what would come next, every eye on the judge, every ear waiting for the next words to come from her mouth. Jamal didn't flinch. He wasn't intimidated by her. "I'm not wasting anyone's time, Your Honor," he said, his voice still calm but unwavering. "I'm here for justice. If that's a waste of time, then maybe this whole system needs to take a long, hard look at itself." Rachel's eyes widened slightly at his words. She hadn't expected him to speak so boldly. But now, she saw that there was more to Jamal than just the quiet man who had walked into the courtroom. There was a fire in him, something that couldn't be extinguished by any harsh words or condescending glances. He wasn't going to back down, no matter who was in front of him. Judge Pierce was growing increasingly uncomfortable. The gavel in her hand rattled slightly, the sound echoing in the otherwise still room. She knew she had to regain control. She had to silence Jamal before his words became something no one could ignore. But deep down, she understood that her power was slipping. Jamal's calm defiance was slowly tearing down the walls she had built around herself, and she didn't know how to stop it. The silence in the room stretched, and for a moment, Jamal thought she might say something more, perhaps accuse him of disrupting the court or threaten him with contempt. But instead, she simply stared at him, her eyes narrowing, as if weighing her next move. It was clear she wasn't used to being questioned like this. It was also clear that Jamal had caught her off guard in a way she hadn't expected. Rachel gave a subtle nod to Jamal, silently urging him to continue standing his ground. He glanced at her, then turned back to the judge. "I think it's time to decide whether this is about truth or about power, Your Honor. You don't intimidate me. I'm here for justice, and I won't let you take that from me." It was as if the words had finally cut through the tension in the room, breaking the silence in a way nothing else had. Jamal's calm but unyielding stand was no longer just about his case. It was a message to everyone in that room. Everyone had been watching a battle of wills unfold, and Jamal had proven, in that moment, that truth and justice would always stand stronger than any person or system that tried to suppress them. The tension in the room was so thick it felt as if the air itself was holding its breath. Jamal's words hung in the air, powerful and calm, leaving Judge Pierce no room to respond. It was clear that the balance of power in the courtroom had shifted, and for the first time, Judge Pierce seemed to understand that she was no longer in control. Jamal had stood up for himself, for what was right, and it wasn't just his defense anymore. It was a fight for dignity, for justice. For a moment, there was only silence. The audience, which had once been nervously shifting in their seats, now seemed to be waiting for what would come next. Every eye was on Judge Pierce, who was still gripping her gavel, her knuckles white with the pressure. She was visibly shaken. In all her years on the bench, no one had ever dared speak to her like this, and now she didn't know how to regain control. Rachel, standing beside Jamal, could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had worked with many clients over the years, but never had she seen someone challenge a judge so directly, with such calm resolve. She had always known Jamal was strong, but this was a side of him she had never seen before, a quiet, unshakable strength. He wasn't just defending himself now. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, who had been denied their right to a fair trial simply because of their race or background. Judge Pierce, now visibly uncomfortable, cleared her throat, trying to regain her composure. "I will not tolerate this any longer," she said, though her voice lacked the confidence it once had. "If you insist on disrupting this court, Mr. Carter, I will have you removed." But Jamal wasn't intimidated. He stood there, facing the judge with unwavering calm. "I'm not the one disrupting anything, Your Honor," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "What you're doing right now, with your bias and your disrespect, is what's disrupting this court." Rachel glanced at Jamal, silently urging him to continue, but she knew this was a delicate moment. She didn't want Jamal to push too far, but at the same time, she knew he was right. He wasn't just standing up for himself. He was standing up for a system that had too often turned a blind eye to injustice. The judge opened her mouth to respond, but then stopped herself. She seemed to be weighing her options, trying to decide whether to press on with her threats or to back down. The longer she hesitated, the more Jamal's confidence grew. It was clear now that he wasn't afraid of her. He wasn't afraid of anyone. He had found his voice, and he wasn't about to let it be silenced. Suddenly, Jamal took a step forward, moving closer to the bench. The room held its collective breath as he spoke again, his words deliberate and strong. "You may wear that robe, Your Honor, but it doesn't make you above the law. Your actions today are a violation of everything this court stands for: fairness, equality, and justice. The silence that followed was deafening. Jamal's words were simple, but they carried the weight of truth. It was as if the entire room had collectively exhaled, releasing the tension that had been building for so long. For the first time, it felt like Jamal had taken control of the situation. The power in the room was no longer with the judge, it was with him. Rachel felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had known Jamal was capable of standing up for himself, but this was something else. He wasn't just defending his case, he was making a statement, one that resonated far beyond the courtroom. She couldn't help but feel proud of him, of the way he had handled this entire situation. It wasn't just about winning the case anymore, it was about something bigger. Judge Pierce, now clearly rattled, shifted in her seat. She opened her mouth to speak again, but then seemed to think better of it. Instead, she glanced at the clock, clearly hoping for a way to regain control without further confrontation. But Jamal wasn't done. "I'm not leaving this courtroom until I get a fair trial," Jamal said, his voice unwavering. "And I will not be silenced by anyone. Not by you, not by anyone in this room. This is about more than just my case. This is about standing up for what's right, and I'm not going to let it go." His words echoed in the silence, and for the first time that day, it felt as if the courtroom had been shaken to its core. No one in the room, not even Judge Pierce, could deny the truth in what Jamal had said. He wasn't just a man in a courtroom anymore. He had become a symbol of defiance in the face of injustice, and no one could ignore it. The courtroom was now fully captivated by Jamal's unwavering stance. There was an undeniable shift in the energy, and the spectators, once quiet and apprehensive, were now watching with wide eyes. Even the officers in the room seemed to take notice of what was unfolding. For the first time that day, Judge Pierce's once confident demeanor seemed to waver. She sat there, her grip on the gavel tight, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and uncertainty. She had always been the one in control, but Jamal had taken that control away with nothing more than his words, his resolve, and his refusal to back down. Jamal remained standing, his eyes never leaving the judge. He wasn't looking for a fight. He was looking for justice. It had become clear to everyone in the room that this wasn't just about the trial. It was about much more. Jamal's calm yet powerful presence had exposed the cracks in the system, and the room was now seeing the true nature of the judge's bias, her inability to separate personal prejudice from her duty to uphold the law. Rachel, who had been watching the scene unfold with a mix of disbelief and admiration, felt a new sense of respect for her client. She had known Jamal was strong, but she hadn't known the full extent of his inner strength. He wasn't just defending himself now. He was standing up for something bigger. This wasn't just about a man accused of a minor crime. It was about standing up to the kind of injustice that had been allowed to fester in the court system for far too long. Judge Pierce was visibly struggling, trying to compose herself. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence between them grew heavier, as if everyone in the room was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The tension was almost unbearable. After a long pause, Judge Pierce finally spoke, but her voice lacked its previous strength. "Mr. Carter, I demand that you stop this nonsense. This is a court of law, not a place for personal opinions," she said, though it was clear she was no longer in control of the situation. Jamal didn't flinch. His voice remained steady, his tone firm but respectful. "Your Honor, this isn't personal," he said calmly. "This is about fairness. This is about making sure that everyone who steps into this courtroom, no matter who they are, is treated equally. What you're doing, what you've been doing, isn't right. And if that's what a court of law is supposed to be, then maybe it's time we reevaluated what justice really means." The room was still, hanging on every word. Jamal's confidence had grown with each passing second. There was no doubt in his mind now. He wasn't just fighting for his case. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly by a system that was supposed to protect them. The judge, the lawyers, the audience. They were all witnessing something that wasn't just about a trial. It was about a man's right to be treated with dignity, no matter his background. Rachel stood quietly by Jamal's side, taking it all in. She could feel the tension shifting in the room. People were beginning to see that Jamal wasn't the one disrupting the courtroom. Judge Pierce's actions had disrupted the balance of justice. Jamal was simply calling it out, refusing to let it go unchecked. Judge Pierce looked around the room, as if searching for support. The officers in the courtroom exchanged glances, but no one spoke up. The power she once held seemed to be slipping away with every passing second. She had no answer to Jamal's calm logic, no response that could undo the damage she had done with her own words. Finally, the judge stood up, her expression one of frustration and defeat. "This is not over, Mr. Carter," she said, though her voice lacked the authority it had once carried. "You'll regret this." But Jamal wasn't intimidated. He stood his ground, his gaze unwavering. "I won't regret standing up for what's right, Your Honor. I won't regret fighting for justice." For a long moment, there was silence. Then, without another word, Judge Pierce left her seat, signaling the end of the day's session. The room was filled with murmurs, but Jamal didn't care. He had done what he came to do. He had stood up, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, ignored, or dismissed by a system that was supposed to protect them. And for the first time, it felt like justice had finally been given a voice. The courtroom was still as Jamal stood there, his posture strong and unwavering. The silence that had fallen over the room seemed to carry a weight of its own. People were exchanging quiet glances, unsure of what would happen next, but it was clear that Jamal had done something none of them had expected. He had changed the course of this trial, and possibly the course of his life. Judge Pierce had left the bench in frustration, and the courtroom was slowly coming back to life, though the tension was still thick in the air. Rachel, standing by Jamal's side, felt a sense of awe at the way he had handled the situation. She had known he was brave, but she had never imagined he would stand up to a judge so boldly. She had hoped for justice, of course, but now it felt like Jamal had taken that hope and turned it into something real, something tangible. He had turned the courtroom into a place where truth could be heard, no matter who was standing in the way. Jamal, though, didn't feel the same rush of victory. He wasn't thinking about his words or the fact that he had forced the judge to leave the room. His mind was focused on the larger picture. This wasn't just about him or the trial anymore. This was about something bigger, something that stretched far beyond the walls of the courtroom. It was about standing up against a system that had treated too many people like him unfairly. It was about the long history of injustice that needed to be addressed, and how one person, one voice, could begin to make a change. The door to the courtroom opened, and a bailiff stepped inside, his face serious. He nodded toward Jamal and Rachel, and without a word, he walked over to the judge's bench. The room fell silent again as they all waited, wondering what would happen next. Rachel caught Jamal's eye, and for the first time in a long while, she saw a hint of uncertainty in his expression. But there was no fear. Not now. The bailiff returned a moment later, motioning for Jamal and Rachel to come forward. It was clear that something had changed. The judge's earlier departure hadn't been the end of the trial, not yet. They would continue, but now, things were different. The atmosphere was charged with a new energy, one that felt like the air before a storm. Something was coming, and no one knew exactly what it would bring. Jamal followed the bailiff to the front of the room, and Rachel moved beside him, her hand brushing against his. She could feel the tension in his body, the uncertainty about what would happen next. He had stood up for himself, but now they were about to face the consequences of that decision. The courtroom was still watching, the audience on edge, waiting to see how things would unfold. "Your Honor," the bailiff began, speaking clearly as he turned toward the judge's empty seat, "there has been a change of decision." A murmur ran through the room as everyone waited for the next steps. Jamal looked around, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. This wasn't just about the judge anymore. This wasn't about the trial or the case. It was about something much more important. The belief that standing up for what was right would always outweigh the fear of standing alone. And then, Judge Pierce returned, but this time, she walked into the courtroom with a different expression. Gone was the confidence that had once radiated from her every movement. Instead, there was something else in her eyes. Perhaps it was guilt, or perhaps it was simply the realization that her actions had been exposed for what they were. She took her seat again, her voice much quieter now, the authority she once held slipping away. "I believe we need to proceed with a different approach," she said, her tone far more measured. "We will continue this trial, but I will not preside over it." Jamal felt a small sense of relief at her words, though he knew this wasn't over yet. The case would go on, but it was clear that Jamal had made a difference. His courage had forced change, had forced the system to take a hard look at itself. As the courtroom began to file out, some spectators paused to offer Jamal quiet nods of approval. Others seemed to still be processing the shift they had witnessed. Rachel, walking beside him, looked at him with pride. "You did it," she said softly, her voice filled with respect. "You really did it." Jamal looked at her, his face a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "It's not over yet," he replied quietly. "But I'll be ready." He wasn't just thinking about the trial anymore. He wasn't just thinking about himself. He was thinking about everyone who had ever been treated unfairly in a courtroom like this one. He was thinking about how his small victory today might be the first step in something much larger. And for the first time in a long while, Jamal truly felt like change was possible.